Welcome to Presentation 11 in the series where we're looking at the Gospel that John wrote. Let's reflect back on where we've been in the previous presentation. Jesus had been teaching the temple precinct, and there have been repeated confrontations with the religious establishment. They kept challenging him. Who are you? Who are you? They wouldn't look at the evidence. The confrontation grew. Jesus had healed a man born blind. Contrast is painted by John. The blind man knew that he'd been physically blind, and now he could see. By contrast, the religious establishment, who were meant to lead the spirituality of the nation, they were not aware of their spiritual blindness. Their minds were closed. They could not see. And they could not see who Jesus was. And Jesus was saying to these Jewish leaders, your problem is this. You claim to be able to see spiritually, but you're still blind. How can you lead people when you don't know where you're going yourself? In all of this, there are two kind of underpinning ideas that Jesus develops. They relate to two words: truth, freedom. In Jesus, God entered our humanity and brought truth to humanity. The Word became flesh and lived among us. God is truth. He made everything. Jesus embodies truth, and he brought truth to humanity, but he also brought freedom. In Jesus, God dealt with the root problem of humanity and offers real freedom. The root problem stems back to this. You can see it in yourself, you can see it in societies, families, communities, nations. There's a kind of controlling grip, a drive. And it's a drive to go the wrong way, do the wrong things, say the wrong things. Almost built into us, compelling us, and we give in to it. The arrow of our life's been fired and it's going off in the wrong direction. But Jesus, as the Son of God, with all the power of God upon him, he has the power and the authority, and he can release real freedom to us. That's why he came. He said, I'm the good shepherd, and he looked forward to what was going to happen, a grim situation. But he also said he knew his sheep, his followers. There's a relationship. Those who follow Jesus are known by Jesus and know Jesus and are prepared to listen to him and go his way. In all of this, Jesus comparing himself to the current Jewish leadership of that time. There's a contrast in that comparison. This is what religious leadership tends always to do. It tends to impose rules that place burdens and barriers on the led. You can just look out at it. Look out at it in all religions. And you can see that pattern is there. Sometimes quite brutally, sometimes quite subtly. That's the contrast. Jesus showed that quite clearly in what he said, what he taught, what he did. He offers safety and security, the picture of the Good Shepherd. He offers access to God. He offers the opportunity to cope with the events of daily living in safety and security. We can move forward to a new quality of life. That's what Jesus offers. And that's a contrast with religion, which cannot and does not offer it. The confrontation with the religious establishment of the day centered on who is Jesus. These people simply wouldn't accept the evidence. Their minds were made up, their minds were closed. God had entered our world in the life of Jesus. They wouldn't accept it. It's not that different sometimes today, where people just look at Jesus and explain him away as a human being or a prophet, and don't look at the evidence. Why do people not believe? The word believe carries the idea of respond. It's practical, it's doing, it's not intellectual. When challenged by them, Jesus focuses on the evidence, something we need to do in all religious contexts. The evidence of what he does. What he did, how he treated other people, how he lived, how he met need, how he healed, how he cared, how he spent all his time lifting other people up and affirming them and encouraging them. There's the evidence that God had entered our world in the life of Jesus. That was the situation then. And these religious leaders simply didn't want to believe, and there was a good reason why. They had built their religious power base, their control over the people, over the nation. They'd given them a cozy lifestyle and given them status. They'd even given them money. Were they going to throw all that lot up? They didn't want to believe. And it wouldn't matter what evidence had been put in front of them. Their reaction would be confrontation and eventually eliminate Jesus. He's a threat to us. But most of the ordinary people, large numbers, were responding positively to Jesus in some measure of commitment, and were finding something of the release that he was offering to them. Now moving forward. Then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. There he stayed. Many people came to him. They said, though John, that's John the Baptist, never performed a sign, all that John said about this man was true. John had introduced Jesus to the nation. And in that place many believed in Jesus. Now believing in, the actual words in the original, not intellectual, it's a word of response, commitment, action. Let's look at a map and just see the various places. There's Jerusalem in the hill country. Jesus had kind of tactical withdrawal over to the Jordan, perhaps somewhere round about there, where John had been baptizing long before. Now there's a small village just outside Jerusalem, a couple of miles outside Jerusalem, Bethany, just in the edge of the hill. It was the home of a family, Martha, Mary and Lazarus, two sisters and a brother. They knew Jesus. Jesus stayed there before, and a message arrives. Lazarus is seriously ill. The implication, come and help us. The family realized that Jesus was the person who could help. They turned to him for help. He'd visited the home before. Luke records it as Jesus' disciples were on their way. He came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. He stayed in that home. He knew the family. So let's look at the text. From chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And then it refers to something that happened later. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Little puzzling signs in this. First of all, the word love there are 4 words in the original language which we translate into love in English. The word used there speaks of family love. Jesus stayed with this family and had developed a relationship with them, like he was a member of the family. But the word used there is a word that has no emotional content. You could translate it as caring that costs. It's the kind of love where you would do anything for somebody else, no matter what it cost you to do it. But you don't do it for any gain or any expectation of return, and you don't do it from an emotional warm feeling. Caring that costs. So there's two different words used there, and it subtly alters the meaning. Caring that costs. But he remained 2 more days. Why the delay? Why didn't he just drop everything and come at once? Now we've got to remember, even if he had dropped everything and gone immediately, when the time had arrived, Lazarus would have been dead 2 days. It all comes back to that. Love, caring that costs, seeking the best for the other. It all rests in God's timing. That kind of love, that kind of caring seeks the maximum benefit for the other person. God's timing, the maximum benefit for humans, and the maximum long-term impact and benefit. That's why there was a delay. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Dangerous. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Enigmatic. The time was not quite right. Jesus was still active. His illumination, the timing was not quite there. He could still operate. It's all back to timing. Timing is everything. Jesus did know that the final showdown was close, but he could still operate freely. But he also knew that raising a dead man to life would be the ultimate challenge to the religious establishment, and it would be the key that forced them to seek to eliminate Jesus. So the delay was for the benefit of people. Let's move on. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. Now this was John, who'd been a disciple, recording this. He was part of it. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let's go to him. Then Thomas. Thomas is known as Didymus. Now, Thomas in one language, Didymus in another language, both mean twin. So maybe he was a twin. Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Focusing on that latter stretch. The dangers faced the group, and the disciples knew that if Jesus was going to be eliminated, there were risks that they would be executed as well. Fatalistic resignation. Thomas doesn't really understand the purposes of Jesus, but while that may be a bit negative, this is very positive. He has the courage to stay with Jesus when he moved right into potential danger. Let us go. Now the way John presents this is the raising of Lazarus. It's the final and greatest miracle, raising someone from the dead. It kind of signed his death warrant for the Jewish leaders, because they couldn't explain that away. They were so concerned that they wanted to retain their religious establishment, their power base, and the way they saw things. Jesus did not fit into the way they saw things. raising some from death, was the final source of confrontation. His execution was now inevitable. By contrast, for the people, raising Lazarus from death brought so much hope for ordinary people. Hope for life beyond death, which they believed in, most of them. But it gave them a hope and a kind of certainty of this, and it encouraged a positive response from many. You see, their supremacy, power base, and their control over the nation, and perhaps their wealth and social status, these were all under the threat because of Jesus. So Jesus had to be eliminated. But the contrast is the positive responses from large numbers in the population. John keeps painting these contrasts as he records the story of Jesus. Moving forward, moving on into chapter 11 a bit further. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Presumably they were all young people. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you wish. Confident belief that Jesus could resolve the problem. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Then Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Positive affirmation of faith. She knew who Jesus was. She was trusting him with all her life. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is the one who's conquered death and who can take us through death, even though they die, physical death, into new life where we will never die. That's open to the one who believes in Jesus. Believes in me, again, it's a phrase that implies a response, action, commitment. The last paragraph. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Now there are 3 apparently similar reactions. One is recorded here, and we'll see in the next frame the other 2. Martha said that. Complete confidence that Jesus could have healed her brother. Mary said almost the same. Some of the observers says something that looks something similar, but perhaps it was more critical, whereas the previous 2 were more a confident faith that Jesus could have saved their brother from death. Moving on, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Hint of criticalness. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. That was the typical kind of grave that was used at the time. and the stone would take several men to move it. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days." Now they did put spices in a body typically, but they didn't do full embalming in those days. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell that if you believe you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Family love, the word there again. Jesus showed deep empathy with the anguish of Martha, in this case Mary. The suffering that death causes, the loss of a loved one, the uncertainty about the future, and perhaps Lazarus was the breadwinner. The words are strong there. They express horror, they express anger. Horror about death and what it does to people. Anger about death. Jesus wept when he saw it. Why should humanity suffer this way? I've come to offer something better. I've come to offer hope and a future. Deep anguish within his being. We need to think about death just a little bit further. The dead man came out. In the original, it's the one having died. He was no longer dead when he walked out. He was now free, restored to physical life, to fulfill his allotted lifespan before his premature illness and death. Now, of course, he was assured of resurrection thereafter. And Jesus had said before, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. In other words, it's going to give clear evidence of who I am, that I am the Messiah, the sent one of God, gone to entered humanity in my life. That was the purpose. It encouraged people to respond, and they did respond in large numbers. At the same time, the religious establishment rejected and sought his elimination. The tragedy is that death, and even worse, the fear of death, it robs humanity of peace. We're clinging on to life without any assurance or hope of what happens afterwards. God never made it to be that way. Death is but a gateway to resurrected life for those who are in Jesus and have come to him. God wants it to be that way for all humanity, and yet so often we rob ourselves of the peace that Jesus can bring. He is standing against the last enemy, death. He went through death, execution by public torture over 6 hours. And his resurrection 3 days later showed that he defeated death, that there was a resurrected life, and that with him we could win through. It was the final great demonstration that Jesus had come from God. He raised Lazarus to life. All the power of God resting upon him. He alone could do that. But sadly, now set in motion is the final confrontation with the religious ruling classes. There's a deep thought in this. The cross was coming, pictured as a glorification of Jesus. Death by public torture, a glorification? Yes, because Jesus took on death and went through it at its worst. And he defeated the powers of evil that were holding humanity in a kind of thraldom. They ravage us. They make a mess of our lives. They lead us astray. He won through. He defeated them. And God showed that he had won through and defeated them because Jesus was resurrected on the third day. Moving forward, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. Same phrase. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. That's the religious ruling council. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. It's an ironic comment. John was writing after AD 70. And because they hadn't responded to Jesus, the Jewish nation that was left went deeply astray. And there were massive divisions. And eventually they had an uprising against the Roman overlords. The Romans would never tolerate that. The nation was falling apart. But the Romans came. They perhaps crucified more than 100,000 men. And what they did to the women was even worse. They sacked the land. They sacked the city. And they demolished the temple right down to its foundations. Jesus could have saved the nation from that. But they rejected Jesus, and it was an inevitability. It's an ironic comment. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. He definitely had a superiority complex. You do not realize it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He did not say this in his own, but as high priest that year he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, not only for that nation but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on they plotted to take his life. John's comment on what Caiaphas said. We know he was high priest from AD 18 to 36 over the period. He didn't know what he was doing, but he was speaking the mind of God. But his intention was very different from what God intended. But John, with hindsight, he can see how Jesus, through his death and resurrection, released spiritual release and unity, and it all came from the death of Jesus. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. Tactical withdrawal. They were after him, but the time wasn't quite right. It would be right just a few days later. But the timing had to be God's timing. Again, a map helps us. There's Jerusalem. We can't be certain exactly where Ephraim is, but probably it's somewhere round about there. But he comes back to Bethany after a period of time, the village where he had friends. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. A massive influx of people from all over the scattered Jewish population. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it, so they might arrest him. Jesus was certainly establishing a reputation. 6 days before the Passover, so it wasn't too far ahead, he comes back to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. A kind of base camp close to Jerusalem. Many in the population realized that he was the promised Messiah, promised in the Old Testament, the sent one of God. But the leadership preferred and chose to see him as a threat to their power base and wanted to eliminate him. Contrast yet again. "6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about half a litre of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of that perfume." Now you find stories like this recorded in all 4 Gospels. We'll look at that just in a moment or two to see how they tie together. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, as keeper of the money bag, used to help himself to what was put in it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." He knew what was facing him. "You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." This is a challenge to us today. Do we really care about the have-nots in our society or the have-nots throughout the world? A challenge to us to meet. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. A responding commitment action. Just collateral damage when they got rid of Jesus. Didn't matter that this man had been given a new life, and the joy that he brought to his sisters and to the whole wider community, and the hope that he brought to large numbers, that there was hope beyond the grave. It's a pattern, and it's a real danger. You see, we can end up pursuing an agenda for our own perceived advantage and dehumanize other people. It can start by us assassinating the character of others, putting them down, thinking that lifts us up, making sure that other people don't get into positions of power and influence that might threaten our perceived power and influence, or even going further, as it can be seen in many countries, dehumanizing them so they're not even seen as human beings. They're expendable, collateral damage. We can eliminate them. And we see that throughout the world. But in the West, the power of social media to character assassinate people with whom we disagree is being abused, something awful. That's the danger. God sees each of us, without exception, as a human life of infinite value in God's eyes. The religious leaders then were quite happy to eliminate Lazarus along with Jesus. Now the story, you'll find it a story recorded in Mark 4 and Matthew 25. Towards the end of both Gospels, so much is the same. The home is named. The woman who puts the ointment on the feet of Jesus isn't named. Protestations over the waste. Caring for the poor, Jesus raises the issue. But Jesus also says in both these accounts, wherever the gospel is proclaimed throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. This story has gone down. Matthew, Mark, and John. And it will be told in memory of Mary. our preparation for the burial of Jesus and our commitment to Jesus, she gave that which was most precious. There's a story also recorded in Luke 6, but it's near the beginning of the Gospel, set in a different area, in a different home. But the woman isn't named either, but described as living a sinful life. That means she was probably a prostitute. She'd gate crashed. And the Pharisee whose home it was said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him, what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Spiritual superiority. Jesus challenged him over that. It's quite a different story. So there are two different events. One Luke records, one that the other three gospel writers record. So probably John is describing the same event, but he emphasizes things slightly differently. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. That's derived from Psalm 118. Welcoming in. Hosanna means Lord save us. These crowds recognized that Jesus was the sent one of God, the Messiah of God. And there'd be large numbers because this religious festival drew Jews from all over the known world. They saw him probably as their Messiah, and they probably had thoughts that the nation would be restored, their spiritual position would be restored, everything would be purified and made better, and perhaps the Romans pushed out. Jesus found a young donkey and sat upon it, as it is written, do not be afraid, daughter Zion. That's the people of God. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. At first his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified, that is his cross and resurrection, did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him. It comes from Zechariah 9. The temptation is, we just simply say, isn't it wonderful? A prophecy was fulfilled. Zechariah was given this prediction exactly. There's an awful lot more to it than that. We need to read the whole of Zechariah and see it in its context, but actually we need to look at it in this context of Old Testament prophecy, the whole sweep of biblical prophecy. We'll do that in a minute. You can find this presented in more detail in the 6th presentation in the series online on the book of Zechariah. But just a quick overview and summary of something of this overall sweep of biblical prophecy. Jesus pictured in the Old Testament as a coming servant king, coming to his people to be accepted and welcomed by his people as he was here. Isaiah has a very clear picture of this. But how would the people react to him? That's the challenge of the prophetic insight. Zechariah places that challenge before the people of his day. He wrote a lot later than Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Challenge and encouragement to people who had been restored to the land but were struggling. How would the people react if Jesus came? The servant king. How would the people react to Jesus when he did come a few centuries later? But for us today, how shall we react today when Jesus comes as servant king to his people? Now, king means he's king. He's in total control. And that means our personal agendas go out of the window. Easy to say. That needs a lot of thought and challenge. But the leadership agendas go out of the window. Jesus is now the leader, the king. And we commit ourselves to doing what he wants. That's very, very different. You could summarize it and bring it together in this kind of a way. We commit ourselves to doing what he wants in his way with his resources. And if you look at the history following the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, groups of people committed themselves to that, and you can see the outcomes. in wonderfully fulfilled lives and an impact that was so positive. And you can see it today in many parts of the world, where groups of the followers of Jesus have committed themselves to doing what he wants in his way with his resources. He is king. He's in control. Back to the text in the last paragraph. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he'd performed the sign, went out to meet him. What a reputation. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." That was what was happening. They didn't like it. They were losing their power base, their control. One of the biggest problems that leadership faces in all realms of life is the fear of losing dictatorial kind of control. Jesus is the servant leader, a different kind of leadership, executed in a very different kind of way. We've got to think that through. The contrast in this is always the crowd saw in Jesus someone who gave them hope, life beyond death, encouraging positive response. He affirmed people. He offered things to people. He brought them something new and wonderful. But the contrast with the religious leadership, his execution was inevitable. That contrast is all over John's Gospel. But Jesus now knew the final showdown was close, and that raising a dead man would be the key, the crunch issue, and that the religious leadership would be seeking to eliminate him once and for all. And in that context, he's now faced with something very important. He's got to prepare and equip his close friends, the disciples, and perhaps beyond that. Prepare them for what lay ahead. At the big religious festival, he was going to be arrested, tried illegally at night, handed over to the Romans for a long 6-hour torture leading to death. His friends didn't understand that. They couldn't see the significance of it. He had to prepare them and equip them, and that will be a theme that we'll look at in the next and perhaps several presentations that will follow, as we look at the preparation that Jesus offered his followers for what lay ahead. And implicit in that is a lot of teaching, which is of great benefit and reassurance to us today.